Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm excited to have two guests for the price of one. So this little get-together of ours right now was inspired actually by a post that I saw on LinkedIn. It was probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I'll get to that in a moment. For now, our two guests that I have with me are James ELFER and Magda OSMAN. James ELFER is founder of Morethannow, a research practice that applies behavioral science to workplace challenges. And I think James has set the record for the shortest bio of any person who's come on the show yet. So congrats to you on that one, James. And Magda is reader in experimental cognitive psychology, Alan Turing Research Fellow, and head of dynamic learning and decision-making lab at Queen Mary University of London. The ethos of her work has been to take a critical eye to well-accepted views and challenge the status quo. And her work also helps to show that methods such as nudges, designed to improve our decision-making, are not reliable, are ethically problematic, and that the public have concerns about them, especially if the nudges are designed by government bodies compared to scientists. So for my listeners, there's some meat there on that bone for us to chew, and I can't wait to definitely get into that. But for now, James, Magda, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Thanks, Nick.
So, as I said, this episode's topic, this is a bit of a different style than my usual conversations and episodes, because there's two of you, not just one, but because it is centering around, in this case, this one paper that is very relevant to the field of applied behavioral science and applying certain interventions or nudges in practice, whether it's policy or the workplace or wherever it may be. So that's very relevant to this show, and probably will be of interest to a lot of my listeners who are tuning in right now. So yes, this was inspired by a post that James put up on LinkedIn, and it was actually linked to a paper that Magda and her colleagues wrote in the Trends in Cognitive Sciences, or TICS, the journal. And the title of that paper is, quote, "Learning from Behavioral Changes That Fail." And when I saw that, the post, and then later read the paper, it just immediately piqued my interest. And the reason was because of my own story in academia. I came in as a graduate student, really young, naive graduate student, thinking that science was the be-all, end-all, and in particular, behavioral science and psychology was the thing that was going to sort of like save me and deliver me, to ultimate freedom. And then I quickly learned that science, like all human endeavors, is flawed. And in particular, my science of social psychology was highly flawed. And I was in a lab, my mentor, so the PI of the lab was Mickey Inslicht, who is a past guest on this show as well, and he was and still is very much rooted in the at the time was the replication crisis in psychology. So we, right towards the beginning or maybe midway through graduate school training for me, was that very notorious and now famous science paper that showed like only a third of our tried and true effects can be replicated in psychology, and social psychology was like the worst of all of the subdisciplines of psychology. So anyways, I ended my academic career, or my graduate school career, and then entered into practice, or became a practitioner, being very cynical of what our science is. I'm still enthralled with it. I still love our science, but I just had a much more sort of skeptical eye to how we do our work, especially outside of a laboratory, when we're in the wild and when we're applying practical and applied interventions and treatments. So anyways, that's the gist, and that's the reason why we're here. But I will shut up and I will pass it over to you, Magda. Can you walk listeners through the paper, maybe just brief the reason for why you and your co-authors wanted to write, and what message is being sent in the piece?
Okay, I'll try. The So I've had a long-standing interest in nudges, so or behavioral change techniques more broadly. So let's say, well, let's kind of try and define some terms here. So what do I mean? These are interventions that are predominantly informed by psychology, um, and also potentially behavioral economics, where rather than using sort of very heavy duty instruments, regulatory instruments to influence behavior at a mass level, so we're talking at kind of population level, or at least large groups of people, rather than using sort of taxes, bans, mandates, that kind of thing, sort of hard measures, you try and use soft measures. So the way you present information, the order of information, the ordering of options. So yeah, I've been interested in that because, well, one, I'm interested in decision making, and also I'm interested in sort of corollaries to this, which is um, you know, agency and control, right? So when you get into all of that, then the nudges literature kind of speaks to a lot of that. So and I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical by nature. So one of the frustrations that I had is that the what's presented publicly, and is also discussed amongst academic circles as well, is the successes of nudges. They're great, they're brilliant. We should be using them left, right, and centre. Well, really, is that really the case? So that it's so well, yeah, let's take a slightly more skeptical view of this, and then so then that's where that's the starting point, which is let's be careful about where we think they might work, and then where they might not work. So so then once you start going down that route, you think, okay, right, it seems like actually quite a lot of them don't work, or at least the ones that are published that you can see have sort of interesting side effects or backfiring effects or null effects. And so then once we're looking at that, you think, well, is there a way to actually classify them, right? So for the things that don't quite go the way you'd expect it, they don't pan out quite as you want, is there a pattern to it? Because if there are, then we're back to sort of scientific bases, right? So once you notice sort of things, you want to classify them and taxonomize them, and then see whether, from that there's opportunities to learn. So it's not, it's not an out and out attack to just say, well, look, here's all of these things that fail. It's more a case of actually there's also from a scientific basis, there's things to learn from things that fail. Right. So that's
you're in the title itself, which is learning from behavior changes that fail. I'm curious, in draft 1 of the manuscript, was that always the title, or did it undergo some revisions?
Yeah. I had a plan of what it was going to look like, and we just basically filled out the details. So
So it wasn't like a nudging sucks title.
Well, I wouldn't have got very far. As it is, like, somewhat ostracized in the field anyway, as it is. So, doing that,
you would have made some enemies. You would have made some enemies.
Exactly. I'll only have made more.
So you mentioned there, and so did I, this sort of attribute of scientists, skepticism, this trait of what makes a good scientist. And I think there's some famous quote by, who's the famous, drawing a blank now, but you guys are going to help me fill in the blanks. The famous astrophysicist, pale blue dot, Carl Sagan. There we go.
Right.
You guys, you helped me. You were mouthing it with your lips. I could tell. Anyways, he has some sort of famous quote. Google it, listeners, and you'll see it. It's basically this idea of striking just the right balance between, as a scientist, being open and having a degree of openness with also a healthy degree of skepticism. And I think when it comes to like a basic researcher, like a scientist, with an institution who's publishing in academic journals, let's say, or a university professor, that skepticism is welcomed and is a good thing. I wonder, and now this is, I guess, to you, James, as a practitioner, and this is why this trio is really interesting, of the sort of the combination we have here. As a practitioner, do you think that behavioral scientists or psychologists can have that same level of healthy skepticism? Or are there sort of other interests at play within policy or business that override skepticism?
Like so many other interests. I mean,
I really lobbed you that one there,
that
eh?
is totally clear. I mean, I guess I should start by saying that I was interested, Nick, when you were talking about your career. In a way, mine's the opposite. In that I started in fairly traditional kind of HR, consulting, culture change type stuff for about a decade before I fell in love with science. So it really has worked in the opposite direction. I think that probably has influenced the thing that I really take from behavioral science, though. And it's been so interesting to see how that term and that discipline has been popularized. So, of course, what people want to hear about is really interesting insights and great stories and interesting examples of research. But to be honest, after 10 years of consulting, what I was really interested in is how we can distinguish between what works and what doesn't. So what I would love to see is more popularization of this idea of experimentation and proper experimentation. And of course, what comes with that is a degree of neutrality and a kind of openness to make sure that we learn from failure. If we don't start an experiment with that fundamental principle in mind, then you're never going to get anywhere. Which I think comes back to the question of the interests that you're kind of battling against sometimes, either in policy or in the leadership of our very large organizations, because the truth is that is entirely counter to the normal way of doing things, particularly when it comes to consulting and particularly when it comes to kind of initiatives around workplace culture. I sometimes joke that within the 10 years that I was doing kind of traditional stuff, I never failed. I never failed at anything. I mean, as it turned out, I never actually succeeded in anything either, because we were never really sure why we were doing what we were doing, and we certainly weren't measuring it. And there was no realization of that, of course, over the decade. But once I did realize it and look back, you think, there's no platform. I didn't create any platform of learning. I can't look back and point to something that I can say, I left that behind, even if it was something small that others could build upon. So I think that is probably what drives me personally, and more than now, more generally, to try to be far more aligned with the sort of principles that Magda is talking about. But yes, there are enormous constraints when it comes to working with both organizations, which is of course our area, and no doubt in the field of policy and change as well.
So many conversations I've had with internally with partners and clients, and more externally with clients as well, that I'm like, but and they're very smart people. Like this is not like, I'm not shitting on them in any way. This is just sort of the difference of the worldview of sort of scientist and scientific testing and experimental testing versus the opposite, whatever that is. And I would say, but how do you know that thing works? Like, how do you know? And they're like, but who cares? We just assume it does, and then we'll continue on, with this campaign, or, the idea of setting like learning outcomes, or targeting certain outcomes and operationalizing it and measuring it, and even running simple A/B tests. I think that's becoming more in fashion nowadays, but it's still an uphill battle I have with a lot of people talk about, like, but we need to not prove, because we don't talk about proof, but we have to have some degree of confidence that this thing we are doing, whether it's a product launch or a marketing campaign, whatever it is, we have to have some idea that what we're doing is actually working, and what we're hoping it's, what we're intending it's supposed to be doing. So I hear you on that one. And James, this, by all accounts, these posts kind of went viral for you on LinkedIn. Like it's gotten some great traction, and started some really good conversation between people on LinkedIn, which is why I love that platform for these very ideas. So you followed up like a day later, I believe, or maybe a couple days later, with a follow-up post that said 5 inclusion nudges that didn't work from More Than Now, your company. So there's that transparency, and there's obviously you showing great initiative to take that neutrality and take a position, and hopefully normalize it for other practitioners to do the same. So can you speak a little bit about what those interventions were, and what ones failed and why?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I should say is all those constraints that I talked about earlier, just in many different areas, are particularly prevalent in this field of inclusion. And I think that's because it's such an important pro-social outcome. Organizations seem to be so keen to show and demonstrate and signal that they are making intense progress on this front. And that makes it even harder to kind of address it in a much more curious, I would say, much more scientific way. But of course, that's what's needed, I believe, anyway, in order for us to make progress, because this is an incredibly complex question. We can never really get anywhere without the support of scientists and that kind of openness. So I'm always keen to role model that as much as possible. And inclusion is a space where we operate in a great deal. I think what I have, without question, learned over a couple of years of doing experiments in this area is that so much does fail. There is such opportunity to cause backlash unintentionally. And I think if you kind of survey the research in this space, it's pretty horrifying, actually, in terms of, forget nudges, the traditional approach of desperately promoting a business case, of rolling out unconscious bias training, diversity training, of doing women specific or any actually underrepresented group specific training or development programs. There is not much evidence that this is making progress, and we are pumping literally billions of pounds into these initiatives over the last decade. And again, I'll repeat the things that I said before. I don't want to get too dark, but I think it's important that we don't really know why we're doing these things, and we are not measuring their effect. And that cannot be right. It cannot be right to have such investment into this huge social issue and to have looked back on the past decade. In truth, as I look back on my own personal decade a few years ago, and don't have much to show for it. So something's got to turn around there. So yes, that didn't actually answer your question about the specific nudges that I mentioned on LinkedIn. But I guess
let's take one. Let's take your.
Yeah.
That's great. What you said is so apt. It's right on the nose. If you could take one example of one that's, say, failed, and walk listeners through it.
Yeah, sure. So let's think. Yeah. So we do a lot of recruitment experiments, and that's mainly because it's a really accessible area for experimentation. The outcomes are very clear. It's quite nice to be able to do. It's quite a nice area to do interventions as well. So one classic example is, how do you introduce a job description, for instance? Really simple, in the first couple of sentences. And one of the interventions, one of the experiments that I particularly enjoyed over the last 12 months is an organization that went and asked their people, why do you work here? What is it that keeps you here? And they said, we just love this job. We just love it. It's kind of an inner passion. So they thought, right, okay, we're going to take that away and we're going to turn that into the first sentence of our job description, which was, it's time for you to love your job. And the reason why I particularly pick on this example is one of the areas of failure that Magda pointed out in her research was this idea of reactants and how that can cause a backfiring effect. Now, this organization was particularly male dominated. So for whatever reason, that reactant seemed to be stronger in women in this case. So when we tested it against a range of alternatives in a randomized controlled trial, we found this huge backfiring effect that when the organization said, you're going to love your job, it turned out that the female audience that they were talking to said, no, we're not. And they decided not to apply. So this is a really good example of how an experiment can show how something good done with good intentions is actually causing the opposite effect. But not only does that mean that we can do things better, but it also is a huge learning opportunity, right, for that organization, because they can also take that small insight and see where it might be occurring elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Thanks for that. And Magda, this idea of reactants, could you elaborate a little bit on that for listeners, and what it is, and yeah, to James' point, just to extend a little further, why it's important for us to consider when we're designing these interventions.
Well, let me start also with an example which kind of adds to James's point. So the diversity sort of literature is a minefield. And again, as sort of James has said, there's good intentions, let's say. We give everybody the benefit of the doubt here, because the alternative is it's hard to swallow. That if you make unconscious bias training mandatory, then that backfires, right? So, I mean, there's separate issues as to the extent to which it has any efficacy, and as far as I judge, it has none. Um, None. And I'm quite happy to be definitive about that. But separate to that, any noise that you get, which might look like it's effective, can result in backfires, especially if you make it mandatory, right? So now, why is that? So why do you get backfiring effects of these kinds, and explain them through reactants, which is and it sort of goes back to something I'm really interested in, which is our sense of agency and control. So any threat, perceived or real, to our sense of agency and control, lead to backfiring, right? So we don't like it if there's something that's meddling with our ability to sort of freely choose what to do. But the thing is that what's interesting also is that we care about some things and not others. So you can mess around with asserting control externally on what people do, and I think that's fine, because I don't really care about it anyway. But for the things that we hold of value in our actions, if there is something that sort of seems like it's interfering with that, what happens is that people want to reinsert their control. They do that in ways that actually subverts what the control is. So you're told to do this, and well, I'm not going to damn well do that. I'm going to do the total opposite of that. Or I mean, that's one form of reactance. Another form of reactance is apathy, right? So there's many ways in which the reactance is expressed, but it essentially, and it sort of goes back to a sort of very old theory, and well established one, which characterizes different types of behavior that result from ways in which essentially what you're doing is that you remove what seems like people's control and sense of agency, and so they need to reassert it. So you can either reassert it in a very kind of deliberate way, and it's sometimes even in a violent way. If you mobilize people, then you can get sort of quite horrific behaviors. Or on a very small scale, you just show your protest in whatever other way, but all of it is designed to reassert your sense of agency and control.
That's fascinating. God, I have so many directions I want to take that.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I just thought it was really interesting to make the point, particularly as you asked at the outset about all the other things that organizations need to achieve other than the goal that they're saying they want to achieve. And I wanted to pick up on Magda's point about mandatory unconscious bias training not working. And broadly speaking, I would kind of agree with the summary that it isn't effective on some measures. But I also want to kind of draw a little bit on the idea of the darkness and cynicism that Magda may have alluded to, but not quite got into, which it is effective for organizations for some reasons. And I think it's important to get into that. So why is it that an organization would say we're going to do mandatory unconscious bias training for all our staff, knowing that some organizations that have done that are kind of tens and tens and tens of thousands of people? It's a huge mobilization of efforts.
The Starbucks with the Philadelphia incident a couple years ago.
Exactly. And in fact, that's a perfect example. Why did they do that? What was it effective for?
PR.
Well, there you go, right? And even that addition of the mandatory aspect, suddenly a leader can say it, and a leader can maybe put their fist into their hand as they're saying it to show how serious they are. And there is true power in that. There is a real effect that an organization seems to be looking for, particularly when they feel under reputational threat, which is obviously what Starbucks were doing at the time. And what's interesting is that there's not much pushback to that. Starbucks was probably the first time when it did happen. There was a really good article that was written in the Washington Post soon after by a couple of social scientists kind of challenging their approach. But broadly speaking, you can still look at, for instance, the gender pay gap reports for a number of large organizations, and they will still report, we really care about this thing, and that's why we're continuing with our unconscious bias training program. And there's not much challenge, despite the fact, as Magda says, that from a research perspective, there's huge evidence that we should be massively concerned that this might be a bit of a waste of time, if not potentially harmful as well. So I think that dynamic is always worth bringing up, because I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And I think we have to find a way to challenge it more publicly.
Do you think, what was that? That Starbucks was 2 years ago or so. Do you think this information is making its way into organizations, into the big organizations? Like, do you think that's happening?
Honestly, not so much. We definitely have a really tight community of partners that we work with, that we've worked really hard to make sure they understand where the evidence is when it comes to training and where more promising alternatives might be in terms of behavioral interventions. But I don't really see that on a broader level. So I still think most of the organizations we talk to will do diversity training in some sense, and are still in the place where they're not really questioning why they're doing it or what outcome they want to achieve.
So, Magda, in the paper, you and your co-authors really point to this idea of giving precedence or giving priority to causal analytic understanding. And you even have this one box which walks through this really great example of organ donation. And it's framed within Bayesian and probabilistic reasoning. Can you, as best as possible without actually having the paper in front of us, can you walk through what that is with that particular example or another one if it's available to you, and why it's important to think about behavioral interventions in this way? If you can, add some insight there.
Okay, but and then there's also a point that I'll probably want to pick up about that James made about unconscious bias, but we'll see how far we get with this.
Sure.
One way to think about it is without having there's the thing that we wanted to do around the kind of causal analysis is you can approach it at two levels. You don't have to have a formal kind of background, so you don't need to know sort of heavy duty kind of Bayesian probabilistic reasoning or any of that kind of stuff to be able to do it. Essentially what it's designed to illustrate is and actually it's characterizing what a lot of people do in the field anyway. So, which is, okay, well, I'm going to introduce this thing as an intervention, but there might be other things, background factors that might interact with what I'm trying to do. So that might kind of nominally be in your head, but the value of trying to do something along the lines of what we illustrate is that if you can draw it out, right? So you don't actually have to add probabilities or anything like that. Better if you can. But what you're essentially doing is kind of drawing a causal map. You think, okay, here's the thing that I'm interested in. this is the behavior. But then once you do that, you think, well, what are the kinds of subsidiary behaviors that I might also want to measure? Right. So the value of us being able to look at failures is because people actually did something along these lines, but intuitively. So it's like, well, here's a way of trying to kind of characterize it. So okay, well, this is the thing, but then this is the thing that I'm measuring, and this is the thing that I'm kind of introducing as a manipulation. What other things are going on in that environment that might interact with that? Right. So there might be other sort of descriptions of things that you have in mind. Oh, well, if it's in the case of the organ donation, what we know is that, well, okay, you might increase those signing up to the organ donation register, but that might mean next to nothing in terms of the actual organ donation organs that are donated, right? So so you think, well, okay, well, that implies two different outcomes, right? So the number of people that sign up versus the actual number of organs that are donated. Right. So so then once you've got that, you think, oh, okay, well, so what other things might influence all of those? Well, how many hospitals actually carry out these organ transplant operations, right? So once you do that, you think, oh, all right, I'm trying to think about this in a slightly more bigger picture kind of perspective, so that you can start trying to link these things up. And one other thing to sort of, the message behind all of this is, we're really good at telling each other stories, right? So, now why is that of value? Is because the story, for free happens to do a number of things that cognitively is useful to us, which is it orders events, it links events. See, oh, well, this happened. But then this happened, right? And this happened because of this, right? So you're already creating order. So this is order, it's like, cause and effect. Right, so you're drawing a connection between these things. So once you're doing that, as soon as you do that, there's enormous value because it exposes lots of interesting variables that you wouldn't necessarily thought of before, which is useful from an experimental perspective, because then you can think about, all right, well, if it didn't work, maybe it didn't work because of all of these other things that I couldn't control. And that's that's the virtue of trying to sort of map that out in the way that we did in the paper.
And I mean, that's the beauty of the scientific training, which you can get in many different ways. So how I got it, we would sit around as students, undergrad or graduate students, and you'd be in a lab meeting, and somebody would come with an idea to run, have a research question, and then test a particular prediction. And ultimately, you'd sort of brainstorm and have an exchange of ideas, and all around, okay, how can we gain as much methodological control so that the control condition is equally matched to the experimental or the treatment condition, save for the one variable of interest that you're interested in looking at. The same thing applies in these applied settings, in workplace or policy. So you have a quote in the paper that says, sort of, practitioners have to ask these questions, and they might not be. So, quote, you say, why might this be useful? Essentially, when planning an intervention, one needs to ask oneself, what factors could be causally relevant to the success of the intervention? How could the intervention influence these factors? What precautionary measures should be taken to avoid failure? Like, these are just the basic questions that I think every group or every practitioner should be asking. So can we imagine then, and James, this, I guess, to you, do you do this at More Than Now with your team, or maybe with clients, where you sit around a table and you have like just an open brainstorming session and say, here's the problem, here's a proposed solution, and here's a set of hypotheses, and then just get into the nitty-gritty of all the different possible extraneous variables and how one might go about controlling them? What does that conversation look like?
Definitely not enough to give a really direct answer. I mean, I think one of the really great things about Magda's paper was it pushed that a lot further, and it made that brainstorm feel a lot more systematic. One of the things that I think has happened with behavioral science and applied behavioral science, particularly in our world, is it's not easy to encourage people to run randomized controls experiments in the field. I think everyone knows that. Most researchers will know that. And a necessary consequence of that is we tend to simplify things a little bit. And I think if I think about ourselves and our own work from a critical eye, there's a bit of reductionism there. That we're often way too focused on a single behavior, for instance, and trying to get a measure for how we can see whether we've changed it. There is of course that brainstorm, and that happens up front, but there's certainly not enough around a specific question and quote that Magda had put in the paper around trying to brainstorm what else could go wrong in a number of different areas. How could this backfire? That's a specific question. But also, what other behaviors around the kind of the central behavior that we're looking at, how might they be either negatively or positively affected? In a way, it seemed to me like what she was suggesting is a kind of pre-mortem for behavioral science.
Yeah, exactly.
Before you run an experiment, you kind of brainstorm all the things that could potentially go wrong. And I think even though that sounds like it's common sense in the way that you put it, actually, I think that is something that most researchers need to do. I think we could do way more of it as a team. And certainly, I found it inspiring as I was reading through to do that in a kind of a systematic way in response to the categories that Magda had outlined.
Can
I think it's one. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Just to add one thing. So, I speak to and work with a number of practitioners. I often get accused of, well, it's all right for you to say this because you work in a lab and you can do what you like, but when it comes to the real thing, we're working under sort of really harsh constraints, and and I appreciate that, but it seems like that's an excuse, right? And I can say that from experience, right? So as someone who's worked very closely in trying to sort of help improve trials done in the field, which is that it doesn't take that much more to think, even if you don't actually introduce any new measures. You just think it through, right? So and actually, in fact, if anyone applies any of these behavioral change frameworks, they're all prescribing the exact same thing, right? So on some level they're saying map out this, that, and the other. They are feasible things, right? It's not asking the impossible, right? So and also in my own profession you get the same things, right? There are people who just you just go off and run an experiment without really thinking about the hypotheses and what it is that they're testing, or any theory for that matter. So it's not like we're all liable to the same thing. It's just you can but the thing is, if you do it enough times, you can make this a habit, right? So it's not impossible to ask to just think a few things through before you start launching into something.
Yeah, especially something that could be more costly or time intensive.
Right, exactly.
And I think one thing you mentioned there, and you have a nice reflection of this in the paper, is like just there's a lot of interventions, mostly in applied context, but also in basic research in laboratories, that are so absent theory or sort of theoretical rationale. It's just they just throw a bunch of stuff together and hope one of the things sticks and that they see the needle move, and then they hark, they sort of hypothesize after the results are known and spin some wonderful story, and it ends up in a manuscript, or it ends up in the lap of a client if it's in practice. But what is so important is understanding the theory that underlies those interventions. And the example that you give is on norm interventions, social norming, and the difference between, say, injunctive versus descriptive norms. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and why that difference between those two things are so important? Is so important.
The interesting thing is, so you can either you either say, well, this is what people typically do, right? Or you say, this is what this is what people typically do if they do the right thing. All right. So one is actually telling you, and it's signaling very specifically what it is that other people are doing. And then also what you ought to do. right? So the thing is that these two things, different types of description, or ways of introducing norms, again, can sort of be somewhat backfiring because, well, actually, the other thing is you can describe things in terms of, well, this is what few people do, right? And you might say, you either sort of try to embellish what typically happens or what is atypical, and people actually might want to associate with the atypical group rather than the typical group, right? You think, well, yes, so what if everybody else is doing this? I don't care. I want to do the opposite.
Yeah.
Or I'm not say that, so that's why that's where some of the backfiring can come in, and also,
Yeah.
well, you might the other interesting thing is that people might go along with the norm up until a point, and then other things kind of kick in where you then you think, well, you give yourself moral license to do the opposite. Right? So that's what I mean, like all of this reveals that ironically, the thing which is the starting point of all of this, which is context matters. But actually, the funny thing is, it's often forgotten. Once you actually put this thing in, you introduce this intervention, whatever it is, a social norm or whichever type of social norm. You think, well, this is where it actually interacts. The context interacts with that thing that you're introducing. So you could inadvertently be creating the opposite of what you intended, which is what happens sometimes. Or it might change or mutate over time, in which case you have to be mindful of how long you're going to measure the effect of the intervention over time. Right. So this is why, some of this stuff that we were able to do was because people actually spent the time collecting data over longer periods than, oh, well, we introduced it for, we tested it the next week, it worked, and then we stop. Well, you don't know, like 3 months from now, actually, people will kind of return to, doing whatever it was they were doing beforehand. So you won't know until you test these things out for longer periods as well. So that's the lesson you learn.
I am
Go ahead, James. Go ahead.
Sorry, Nick, I am constantly amazed how behavioral scientists, particularly when they're speaking in the public domain, can, in the one hand, hold this law of context matters, and on the other, kind of make grand pronouncements about what's going to work and what isn't. The idea of social norms speaks to an experiment that we ran with Transport for London when we were encouraging people to submit a kind of voluntary diversity data. Transport for London had kind of put a campaign out to try to increase their knowledge of where people were coming from, their backgrounds and their experiences in their organization. And we used a social norms message that worked really well if people came from an underrepresented background. If they received that message, they were more likely to submit this data. But had the exact opposite effect for a white British audience. It didn't work for that particular population. And I think this speaks to these ideas that we say context matters for a reason. There might be some psychological principles or levers that we can pull on, but we have to go and explore how that works, not just in a particular context, but for particular subgroups as well. And but broadly, I think this is a really interesting just position for where behavioral science is at the moment, that we have these ideas that we can draw upon, but actually we really need people within the field to explore them against the outcome that they particularly want and in the context they're particularly in. And actually, I'm not sure how much we can learn until that happens at a larger scale. We can't just continually do these lab experiments and then make generalizations about how they may or may not work in the big wide world. It feels like we have enough results to show that's not going to get us anywhere. But of course, that needs a much closer collaboration between researchers and practitioners. And I think there's all sorts of flexibility that needs to happen there on both sides. I think it's about coming into the center. It's about practitioners understanding the value and the importance of the research and not coming back with these words of, it's not practical enough or it's not efficient enough, when actually, they might have been doing the same thing over and over again for 10 years without it working. But equally, it's not about academics kind of shying away and staying in their in the halls of their institutions either.
Yeah. What you just said there, James, I think I should either get tattooed on my body or at least a print on my wall, because it's just sort of the one thing that I live by in my work and in my life really is bringing those two audiences together, because I think once we do that, there's so much potential there, and there's so much need for it in the world in many different ways. And when I was in academia and I kind of started to entertain the idea of leaving the academy and going into practice and becoming a behavioral science practitioner, there was like this implicit like this shame, like, oh, he wasn't good enough to cut it in the real world where we do real science. And that still exists, I know, because I have a lot of just colleagues and friends who are still in academia, and I'm shocked at how little the two worlds talk to one another, and how there are these certain stereotypes that either side holds of the other. It's so important that I think the two worlds come together. So yeah, thank you for bringing that to light.
Can I?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, please.
Let me add to this. So yeah, and I'm incredibly sympathetic to this, and yeah, I will say, yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I do. So yeah, so my research is kind of split in basic science, and then applied science, and the most hardest thinking I've ever done is in the applied science world. You think, well, how can I abstract with any degree of confidence what is presented in the academic literature to then trial it for real, like where it really matters, that it carries consequence. You have to it's almost like you have a gun to your head in a way. You think, right, I better damn well get this right. And so the think through the consequences of that has meant thinking far harder than I have done for any of this basic science stuff that I ever do. But you're right in saying that no one credits me in the same way, right? So it just seems like it's like, oh, why are you wasting your time with fluff? Right? It's just fluff, isn't it? It's bad because it's just an indictment of what actually is really going on. And that seems somewhat unfair, although I suspect the tide might be changing somewhat because of the value of nudges and all of that kind of stuff now.
Yeah, and in my own work, a big part of the strategic mission is having those academic partnerships. And anytime I go to just have a conversation with an academic and I say, here's what we're doing, and I basically get to the point where I'm like, yeah, and we're collecting like tens of thousands or sometimes hundreds of thousands of data points, and they're like, yes, where do I sign up? So you just talk their language and sell them on the fact that there's tons and tons of data, and they're like, yep, I'm interested in a collaboration. So I'm confident that indeed the tides are changing. One final point, and I've kept you guys over. I'm so sorry, but this is just so fascinating. So I'm gonna wrap up with one final question, and kind of to both of you, if you want to riff off it. This idea of reactants, and we're now sitting in the UK. There is the Pfizer vaccine that's coming out for COVID, and Canada is now at the last stages of regulatory approval, and so is, a lot of countries around the globe are sort of at the stage of releasing the vaccine. And there's a lot of concern, not just on the logistics side of how do we actually do this, and on an operational stance, but more importantly, and perhaps more interestingly, is how do we convince millions of people to do this, to get the vaccine? Because by some survey and poll results, I'm seeing that between 30 and 40% of people have great hesitancy and are concerned, and some people are even saying they wouldn't get it. There's no way they would get it. So there's the one sort of obvious option, which is we'll make it mandatory. But clearly that's might not work given what we know of reactants, and given what people and how they push back against feeling like they don't have any control. So what do you think is the best strategy for these vaccinations as they become available?
I guess I'll go first.
I'm so glad you said that, Magda.
Well, I'm not going to say anything terribly useful, but what I will say is that a lot of the survey work that is done sort of around the reluctance to take the vaccine is, it's not that people, it's not like, it's a category of people who just are anti-vaxxers overall, right? So that again, this is where context nuance matters. Which
Mm-hmm.
is that it's like, you think, well, have you actually taken vaccines before? Yes. But would you take this vaccine? No. You think, well, why? Yeah, but then it's not like people are actually coming up with ridiculous things, right? So
Yeah.
there are concerns about the fact that it's fast tracked, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
that's a cue to sort of being skeptical, then it's not an insane one, right? So you think, well, one is well, what do we know about the side effects? Has it been trialed long enough to be able to, right? So you need to say. Of course, you're not going to get a very speedy, quick, obvious silver bullet answer here, because the thing is that there's a profile of responses that people are giving, which is unique to the current situation that we're in, which is that it's not that we overall have sniffy about vaccines. It's this particular vaccine because of how it's introduced, how it's trialed, its efficacy, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And its efficacy given the people that it's been tested on, right? So, if you want to target trying to convince people to take it, then you have to work with the messaging that targets precisely the concerns that people have,
Yeah.
right? So, and those concerns, are broadly legitimate. They're not insane concerns. It's not like, people just sort of, maybe there's a very small proportion that are just like, I won't take any vaccine, but it's not representative of that
Mm-hmm.
proportion, right? So then you think,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, let's dismantle the reasons why they're concerned, and then see, well, what evidence do we have that can actually directly speak to that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Good caveat. And James, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, my strategy was just to agree with whatever Magda said, which I'm definitely going to follow. But I have to reflect on my instinct when you were first talking, which is a lot of the time over lockdown and as this pandemic has hit us, I've been really conscious to actually not speculate too much about things that I don't know enough about, and this definitely comes within that category. And I suppose to leave it to the experts. Although one thing I did think of when Magda was talking was just the sophistication of it. We've just had a whole conversation about making sure that when we are looking at behavioral problems, we do sit around the table and try and use a framework as much as possible about what could go wrong. What evidence do we already have, particularly on the survey data that Magda already referenced, and trying to cover all bases. And in truth, I always think it's that systematic approach, as much as possible, getting people around the table that have got kind of a multidisciplinary profile as a group, and making sure that it's done step by step. And as much as possible, avoid kind of throwing in grenade ideas from a position where all I've really got to go on is my own experiences, which I would always not want to do. So in short, I agree with Magda.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in this episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just head on over to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noel Rain, and visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Definitely go and check it out. Lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast fix. Quite a bit of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.